Today is Monday, January 31st, and I'd like to wish you all a happy Memorial Day for St. John Bosco, who's one of my favorite saints, one of my most inspiring saints. I've spent a great deal of time studying and learning about St. John Bosco because of his work in education, and I've always found him to be a great source of inspiration. At times when I'm worn out or frustrated or just discouraged in my work through the years, I've turned to the life of St. John Bosco for encouragement and inspiration. And so, as I take time today to meditate on the life of St. John Bosco and how his life and example might help us as Catholic teachers and parents, my mind is drawn to the fact that John Bosco was a poor Catholic. He came from a poor family. His father had died when he was young. He lived in an agricultural peasant household where grueling physical labor was the norm. And in God's providence, John Bosco had intellectual gifts, spiritual gifts that were recognized by priests who had interacted with him and who were involved in his catechesis. He was given the opportunity to study and made the most of that opportunity, went through seminary, became a priest, and eventually became the founder of the Salesians, and is loved as one of the most widely known and popular saints in the Catholic Church. If you don't know much about St. John Bosco, I recommend you hop on Google and search for the life of St. John Bosco. There are 2 films that have been made on the life of St. John Bosco recently. I know there are usually older versions, sometimes in other languages, Italian, maybe even silent for some saints. But there are 2 films that have been made recently to celebrate the life of St. John Bosco. And the one that I recommend is an older one that was actually produced by the Salesians. And the actor who plays John Bosco is Ben Gazzara. If you find that edition, that's the one I recommend. Both of them are good, but that one is better. So I recommend you watch the life of St. John Bosco with your children. If you'd like to go further, there's a book published titled The 40 Dreams of John Bosco, because John Bosco received John Bosco had inspired dreams that directed him during the course of his life, and that book is an account of those dreams and how those dreams were fulfilled throughout his life. Really great stuff. So I recommend any time spent learning about John Bosco is time well spent. But what inspires me the most about John Bosco is he was a problem solver. He was resourceful. He was a builder. He wasn't a modern consumer. He wasn't a critic. He didn't sit around finding fault with other people's works. He was obedient to his superiors. He was obedient to the church. He solved problems at his own expense. And even though he was poor, he always found a way. He always found a way. And I think that example of his character is what's most important for us today as Catholics, is that he never had resources, but he always found a way. And one of the keys to his success is that he was always willing to start in humility. He was willing to take a path to solve problems that required him to start out in humility. And this work that we have to do, when there's a problem to solve, everyone assumes that there's some way to first get all the money together, get all the resources together, get all the people together, and then in comfort and convenience, carry out these works to solve present problems. And that's not how it works. Often, the problem exists, and the solution is in front of us, but in order for us to embrace that solution, we have to embrace humiliating circumstances. It takes a saint to embrace those humiliating circumstances, because there's always critics, there's always scoffers, always mockers, and they will sit and watch as a person begins to work to solve a problem, and they will laugh and mock and criticize his every step, because there are many constant failures and obstacles that have to be faced by someone who actually solves problems. And it makes for easy attacks from mockers. And it takes a great deal of humility and patience. It takes a great deal of faith and hope and charity to be able to overcome all of those obstacles, fight through all of those failures, persevere through all of the disappointments, and succeed in the end. It takes a saint or a very wise man to be able to do that kind of work. And we live in a society that sits around watching other people and thinks that criticism is a sign of intelligence. And so this pressure is even greater in our arrogant, critical, idle generation than it may have been in John Bosco's generation. And so I really find John Bosco's poverty, his humility, his perseverance, those qualities have always been very inspiring to me, because I'll be the first one to admit, doing the work of restoring the classical liberal arts has brought into my life an almost endless stream of failures, disappointments, discouragements, scoffing, criticism, on and on and on. And yet, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is now in the best position it's ever been. It's been self-sufficient financially for 13 years. And we just continue to march forward. And we are succeeding in building the solution. And St. John Bosco has been centrally important in our work. Not that he's been involved directly in any kind of supernatural way that we can know of, but his example has always helped us through the difficult points. And so what I'd like to talk about today, I want to get right to the point. I want to talk about homeschooling. And I want to talk about how homeschooling families need to use their financial resources to solve the problem that they face. I want to talk about how homeschooling families should use their financial resources to solve the problem that they face. The problem that they face is that they need to educate their children in the best way possible. They need to give their children an extraordinary Catholic education in an anti-Catholic age when there is very little or no help from the church in the work of education. In saying there's no help from the church, I'm not criticizing the clergy because I don't believe it's the clergy's responsibility to educate the children of Catholic laymen. I believe it's a responsibility that ultimately belongs to the parents, and many of them are unprepared for it, and they're reproducing without any preparation for the challenge that comes once those babies are born. The work of parenting is incredibly difficult work. The work of providing children with a real Christian education is incredibly difficult work. I don't believe that Catholic parents take the responsibility seriously enough. I don't think they count the costs of providing their children with a quality Catholic education. I talked about that in another talk titled "The Costs of Homeschooling." And in the end, I think many Catholic homeschooling families make big mistakes that cause them to fail and not achieve their goal. And this is especially true in 2022 because life is so different today than it was even 30 or 40 years ago. St. John Bosco's life has a lot to offer us to help, because we're going to need to imitate a saint like John Bosco if we're going to successfully raise Catholic children, or I should say fulfill our duties to our Catholic children in 2022 and beyond. And I'd like to talk specifically about methods and the use of money by Catholic homeschooling families. We'll often hear people ask questions, and I get this question, but we'll hear people ask questions like, if money was no object, how would you educate your children? If money was no object, how would you design your house? If money was no object, what kind of school would you create? And all of those discussions are stupid, useless discussions. Because the whole challenge of real life problem solving is that everything is limited. That's the actual challenge. It's a complete waste of time to talk about what you would do if this was no factor, if time was no factor, if money was no object, on and on. These stupid, idle conversations. We need to have the opposite conversation. Rather than talk about what we would do in fairyland, what we would do if we weren't who we are, we need to talk about what should be done with all of the limitations that come with real life, because this is where the truth lies. This is where prudence exists. People who are pretenders in any field like to have those conversations about what you should do if money's no object, if time is no object. They love to talk about the what. They love to just ramble and talk about these abstract ideas that are never incarnate. They're never accountable to the constraints and challenges of real life. They love to talk at conferences. They love to write books. But they don't actually engage in the real works in time and space. They make excuses when it's time to actually work. They excuse themselves from the projects. They blame other people for the problems. Because when it's time to actually do the work, they really have no idea what to do, or when it comes to the real costs of the real work itself, the real sacrifice, they have no will for the actual work. They like to stay in idle talkland, talking about things, criticizing what other people are doing, but you won't see them put a shovel in the ground and actually do something. Except, of course, what makes them money. They're very resourceful when it's time to make money, but when it's time to actually build solutions and solve problems, you'll find that they really don't do anything. They just talk. And this is an especially troublesome problem in modern Christian society. How many times have you watched or heard Catholics complaining that we don't build beautiful cathedrals and churches anymore? How many times have you heard laymen complaining about what the priests and bishops are doing? How many times have you heard a Catholic make excuses and blame failures on what other people have failed to do, rather than taking responsibility for his own life, for his own works, and finding solutions at his own personal expense, and overcoming obstacles, overcoming limitations and hindrances? Modern Christian society doesn't have the character of overcomers and achievers, of problem solvers, of saints. Most Catholics sit around criticizing what other Catholics do, who do anything at all, and pretend that they can't do this or that because of something that someone else is doing or not doing. It's an excuse-making, childish, weak, excuse-making culture. And I am sure that you hear this kind of talk all the time, and possibly even engage in it yourself. The real challenge that we face as homeschooling parents is that we need to give our children an extraordinary Catholic education in 2022 in the presence of an anti-Catholic culture with little or no external support. We are limited in money. We are limited in time. We are limited in understanding. We are limited in physical strength. All of these limitations are real. They're part of the problem. And the solution to the problem has to take into account all of these limitations. Any idea that's proposed as a solution that doesn't take into account these limitations is just idle nonsense. Anyone can sit around proposing solutions that someone else needs to actually carry out and pay for. That's not problem solving. That's not responsibility. The real challenge is to overcome all of the obstacles that we face in our real life to accomplish our goals. Prudence is the ability to make decisions that actually are reasonable within the real circumstances of everyday life. You only have so much money. You only have so much time. There's only so many people who can help. All of the obstacles you face, if you made a list of all the obstacles that you face, I hear them all the time. I hear homeschooling mothers say things like, well, my husband is not a Catholic. My husband is not a devout person. We don't have much money. We have only one income. We live with our parents. All of these, we can't afford more than one computer for the children. My husband is sick and has been out of work for a while. On and on, we can multiply all of these obstacles, all of these limitations. And what I say to all of these obstacles is, nobody cares. It doesn't matter. Everyone has obstacles to overcome. Everyone has limitations. Everyone does. That's normal life. It's not an excuse. It doesn't give you a get out of responsibility free card because you can find that there are obstacles in your life, because there are obstacles in everyone's life. You may not think so, but it's because you don't look carefully enough. You may find one family that has no money, but they have incredible physical health. You may find another family that has incredible wealth, but has no physical health. You may find another family where the parents don't have a great education, or they don't have any education at all, but they have time. And you may find other people who are brilliantly educated, but they're so busy with their own careers and stuff that they have no time to even talk to their children. Everyone has obstacles. Everyone has limitations. And overcoming these obstacles is the whole work of Christian parenting and education, and Christian life in general. We all have obstacles. These are all given to us and permitted within God's providence, and none of them excuse us from any responsibility, especially in the 21st century, especially in modern America. Because if we talk about the obstacles we face, when I say things like, we live in an anti-Catholic society, as much as I can point out an obstacle we face that someone living in 13th century France didn't face, we can talk about that obstacle, but at the same time, we can turn around and say, yeah, but we have resources and opportunities that they couldn't dream of. in that place and at that time. We have obstacles, but we also have benefits. The most common obstacle, however, for Christian families, for Christian homeschooling families, the most common obstacle is money. And this is reasonable. It's normal in American society for married couples to both work. That's normal. It's not necessarily right, it's not necessarily productive or wise, but it's normal. And so right off the top, if a Christian family decides that mom is going to stay at home and care for the children and for the family home, which is far more important than many people understand because they're short-sighted. If mom decides, or I should say mom and dad, husband and wife decide, not that mom decides, but if the husband and wife decide that the wife is going to stay at home with the children, care for the children, care for the household, and educate the children, right off the top, there's a great decrease in income potential for the family. Many stay-at-home mothers will try to make some money from home, which I don't believe is a good idea. We have to understand that having a stay-at-home wife and mother, having a housewife, and homeschooling are going to reduce income for the family. And that's not necessarily a problem because many benefits are gained at the cost of money. It's not that big of a deal if the husband and wife learn to manage their household as a homeschooling family and don't try to live like people around them who are not homeschooling families. If you live in the midst of a modern suburb, it's unlikely that your neighbors are homeschooling families. And you can't simply follow the river of human custom and do what everyone else is doing because your circumstances require different practices. You have to evaluate the needs of your own family and you have to provide solutions for your own family with blinders on because you're responsible for your family. And if you're still subject to the influence of things like peer pressure, or you can't make a decision based on principles, but your decisions are made, whether you admit it or not, they're made and influenced by what he thinks or she thinks or what they might say or what this might make us look like or how this would affect us or if this would be awkward. If you're still like a middle schooler worried about the pimple on his face and you're 30 years old now and raising children, you've got to grow up. Because in order for your family to thrive, you have to make decisions that are prudent for your family in your unique circumstances. You can't just lazily imitate other people, and that includes people around you. That also includes people in history. You can't sit around watching Jane Austen movies and say, we're going to live like the Bennett family. That's called playing. That's not real life. That's a fictional story. You can't base your real life on a fictional story. You can't say, I'm going to live like this saint did, because that saint lived in different circumstances than you live. And it's likely that that saint became a saint by living rightly in his own circumstances, not by just mindlessly imitating somebody else, which is just acting. You can't become a saint by dressing up and pretending that you are Saint Augustine or Saint Teresa of Avila. You can't just act like a character and imagine that that's the Christian life. Many Christians are acting like characters that aren't even Christians or that weren't even real historical people. They're imitating fictional characters that they encounter in movies and books that they like. And they torment themselves in real life by trying to live according to fantasies, rather than planting themselves in the context of their real life, setting their goals, and then asking, in my life, in my circumstances, how can I get from where I am to that goal? That's how problems are solved in real life. And all of the obstacles, all of the restrictions, limitations, all of the hindrances are part of that problem and part of the solution. But like I said, when a family chooses to homeschool, when a husband and wife decide that the wife is going to stay home and serve the role of a housewife and mother, and homeschooling housewife and mother, everything has to be rethought. Everything about the household needs to be redesigned. Everything needs to be brought into alignment with the goals of that individual family. And all the circumstances are unique. For example, what does Dad do for a living? What's Dad's schedule? Does Dad have time at home? Does Dad work from home? Does Dad have to travel? How much money does Dad make at his job? All of these different things are unique circumstances that affect what the family can and should do as a homeschooling family. For example, 15 years ago, when I was working as a private school teacher, I made a relatively low income. In fact, my salary teaching in Charlotte was only $37,000 a year. My wife was a stay-at-home housewife and mother who was preparing to homeschool our children. I did not make much money. Like I said, around $3,000 a month. It was sufficient for us to pay our essential household bills. And I mean essential. I'm talking mortgage, utilities, taxes, and so on. Essential bills. There was very little money for anything beyond those essential bills. However, the teaching profession gave me a benefit that other men don't have. Men who make multiple times as much cash income as I made as a teacher. The benefit that teaching gave me as a man, as a husband and a father, was time. I had a lot of time. I didn't have to travel for business. I didn't have to put in long nights at the office. I didn't have all kinds of deadlines and pressures to deal with throughout the year. I only had to go to work 180 days out of the year. I had the entire summer off. I had Christmas break off. I had Easter break off. I only had to go to work 180 days a year. And so the number on my paycheck didn't reflect the quality of life that was available to my family, because we had other resources that other families don't necessarily have. We had time. So, for example, we were able to have beautiful family gardens that we all worked in together. We were able to have a family farm that we took care of. We had a rich, beautiful family life, and I didn't make a lot of money, but I had other resources. So there's more to this than just how much cash does the head of the household earn each month. There's also a quality of life associated with that amount of cash. It can be great, it can be terrible. But that's one of the constraints on our life. So for example, Dad can make $150,000 a year, but he's never home. And I mean never home. So Mom can have a bank account full of cash, but she's working in isolation as a parent. That cash is going to disappear quickly. And in the end, we're going to have to ask, is that family actually better off in this work than a family that makes less money but has other resources available? So, if you have financial limitations, and everybody does, if you have financial limitations because you're a homeschooling family, don't make more of them than you should, because you likely are exaggerating the actual problem that's being caused by money. It's not a certain amount of money that's needed. What's even more important is what you do with the money that you have, because most people who have lots of money just waste it. There's a proverb that says, "The fool and his money are soon parted." Many people who have money waste it because they don't worry about losing it. They make all kinds of foolish decisions, and their solution for everything is just to throw money at it. And so they've got money going all over the place. And even though they may have more money than you, the net effect of their expenses at the end of each month may be nothing, because the money is just dissipated all over the place in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different directions, and nothing is actually accomplished by all of their expenses. And this is why the short-sightedness of modern people is so dangerous. They're not paying attention to the overall progress of their family, or the overall achievement, or achievement relative to expense. They just deal with things by the minute, and money is always available to throw at each problem. So don't exaggerate limitations that you face related to money. You don't need a lot of money to give your children an extraordinary Christian education. You do not need a lot of money to give your children an extraordinary education. And if you spend a lot of time complaining about money, I will guarantee that the problem isn't actually money, it's other things. Like the fact that you use money terribly, that you make bad decisions, that when you do get money, you waste it. And the steps that need to be taken to make good use of your money, you won't be willing to take. It's very unlikely that the amount of money that comes into your household each month is insufficient to provide your children with an excellent Catholic education. So let's talk about what's necessary and what you should spend your money on. Because like I said, the limitations that we face are reality. The problem that we face, the goals that we have, can only be solved and achieved if we take into account the obstacles we face and find solutions to overcome them in real life. That's what it means to solve a problem. If you make excuses for things, you're just kidding yourself. There's no excuse. People have achieved more with less. People have overcome greater obstacles than you will ever face. And there's a whole army of witnesses that stands to condemn every excuse you make because they overcame greater problems. And step one is just stopping all of the excuse making, all of the blame shifting, and taking responsibility for the achievement of the goal. As a parent, to say, the buck stops here. When you read stories about saints, and you read about all kinds of extreme things that they did, when you read that Saint Catherine of Siena slept on the floor, on the stone floor, why do you think they did those things? I read that Saint Martin de Porres would work himself to exhaustion, and because he was concerned that he wouldn't be able to get up the next morning for prayer, he would actually go to sleep in the chapel so that he could wake up when prayer started. Why do you think saints did these crazy things that we read about in their lives? The reason was they were practical measures. They were simple, practical measures. Do you have a hard time getting out of bed? Well, are you laying in a pile of pillows with a big, heavy, soft, warm comforter over you? The reason why it's hard to get out of bed is because you make it so difficult to get out of bed. So when you look at Catherine of Siena and you say, she's sleeping on the stone floor, the reason why is because she doesn't want to make it hard for herself to get up in the morning. If you're tired, really tired, because you're working hard, the stone floor is good enough to sleep on because you just want to go to sleep. But as soon as you've served the needs of your body and have gotten the sleep that you need, the discomfort of the stone floor takes away any desire to keep sleeping. And so a person is able to pop up in the morning after an uncomfortable night of sleep that is sufficient for the need of the body. That's why someone would do that. The saints were not a bunch of weird miracle workers, even though they did, some of them, work miracles. They were practical problem solvers who, when they set a goal, they considered no practical measure too extreme if it would help them accomplish their goal. They were sincere about their goals. They didn't care what anyone else thought. If they knew that the goal was this or that, any practical measure that helped them achieve that goal was to be considered and tried. And we need to take on that spirit of being practical, realistic Christians. We have obstacles. We have limitations. We cannot use them as excuses. Most of our problems are self-inflicted. And if we're not willing to change those things, then rather than make excuses, we have to start confessing the truth, which is that we are simply not actually interested in achieving the goals that we talk about. Because when we come to a practical measure that would be helpful or even necessary, we're not willing to do it. That's where the saints separate themselves from normal people. That's where the saints separate themselves. I'll give you an example from the life of St. John Bosco. St. John Bosco had this great idea of gathering all of the boys, all of the street boys together and trying to catechize and help them. Sounds like a great idea. Everyone would hear this idea and applaud. However, they had to have an actual place to gather. Where would they gather all of these street boys, these foul-mouthed, rough, criminally minded boys? Where would they gather these boys so that they could actually have these meetings and classes and do all these wonderful things? When it came time to find a place, all the people who were applauding the idea disappeared. No one wanted these boys on their property or in any of their facilities. They loved the idea as long as it remained as an abstract idea, idle talk. But as soon as it moved to, okay, so where can we meet? The only person left standing was John Bosco. And so John Bosco had to find a place for these boys to meet, and he had to come up with money to pay rent for the place where they would meet. And if you watch the movie of the life of John Bosco, you'll learn of one man who was willing to host the boys. He was a generous Christian man, and he was willing to host John Bosco and his boys. The problem was all the man had was part of a barn. And the ceiling in the barn was not even high enough for anyone to stand up under. And so John Bosco visited and he said, while it's kind of you to offer us the opportunity to meet in this space, it's simply too low. We can't even fit in this space. And this man proposed the idea that they dig the floor out, because if you lower the floor, you raise the roof. And you can think of what a ridiculous situation this is. And yet John Bosco was willing to accept that situation. You know what? That'll work. It's better than nothing, better than what we have, and it will allow us to achieve the goal, which is all that matters. And so they dug the floor out of this barn area, which made it high enough for them to stand inside, and they started having their meetings in this man's barn. And John Bosco's whole ministry, which of course now he's famous for, started by his willingness and the willingness of another Christian man to do whatever they could, to take whatever practical measures they could to achieve the goal. And you can imagine that that would be embarrassing, humiliating. to be seen in that circumstance. But that's the difference between saints and idle talkers. The saints were practical, and their humility and their sincerity allowed them to overcome the obstacles of embarrassment. They took practical measures. They never thought that they were above a practical measure, whereas today, everyone thinks that they're too important to take some humble practical measure. They'd be embarrassed. What would other people think if they saw me actually practicing what's necessary for me to carry out my religious duties? They're not willing to do what's necessary. Yet if we turn and look to the secular world, if we look at non-Christians with their goals, we find no such obstacle. You can go and learn about billionaires and millionaires who started companies that have become successful. They had clear goals. They were able to envision solutions to problems. And when they began the pursuit of those solutions, they pursued any practical measure that was necessary. They slept under their desk. They lived out of their car. Elon Musk slept and lived in his office. And now we see them in their success and we say, oh yeah, well, if I could be a millionaire like Elon Musk, I would do this and that. Elon Musk didn't do this and that after he became a millionaire or a billionaire. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and all these other famous worldly men became successful because they solved problems with no resources by doing everything that they could do at each point, taking any practical measures that were necessary to accomplish their goals. That's the difference between the problem solvers and the saints and the idle talkers. Men in the secular world are often motivated by inferior things. They may be motivated by pride or by a desire for fame or desire for pleasure or just a simple desire for wealth. Saints don't have those motivations. They have to be motivated by true spiritual rewards. They have to be motivated by the desire to help their neighbor. They have to be motivated by the desire to strengthen the church or to glorify God or to gain eternal life. And that's what ultimately separates the saints from those who merely talk about problems but can't solve anything because they won't take practical measures. So as a homeschooling family, you have to take practical measures. You cannot allow yourself to waste resources because it's what other people do. You can't allow yourself to waste resources so that you can continue to look like other people, so that you can avoid standing out, so that you can avoid being different. If the path to the goal requires you to take some practical measure, you have to be willing to take that practical measure. And if you're not willing, it's the end of the discussion, because there may not be another way. Now, one of the problems we have in modern society is that education has become the subject of idle talk. And one of the biggest sources of trouble, and I talk about this quite a bit, is talk about learning styles. Well, what is your learning style? Oh, I'm a visual learner. Oh, I like to learn this or that. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. The real life obstacles and restrictions of time and money, the real life requirements of real education make it so that there is only one learning style that is possible. There's only one learning style that is possible. Rather than sit there and talk about your learning style, and when you do that, all you do is disqualify yourself from real learning. Rather than talk about your learning style or let idle people tell you that you should study like this, or sit there as a Christian and say like, oh, well, I don't like the internet, I like printed books, I like leather-bound books, oh, I like this, I like that. You're lost in crazy land because the goal doesn't care what you like. The real life requirements of the goal don't care what you like. This isn't a game. This isn't a play or a television show. This is a real life problem that needs to be solved. And the real problem doesn't care about your cute little cultural ideas. The fact that you would like to have your house look a certain way, or that you would like to have your children dress a certain way, or that you have a favorite movie and you're trying to live out that movie in reality. That you'd like to have a house full of books, as if you live in Victorian England. All of those things are going to be self-imposed obstacles that cause you to fail to achieve the goal. The standard of Christian learning is at the top of a mountain. We're limited in time, in strength, in finances. We have to get to the top of that mountain, and the guides who have been to the top of the mountain tell you what to do. And you choose to disagree with them and say, well, maybe that's your way to do. The problem is that you've never been to the top of the mountain. No one has ever taken your way and reached the top of the mountain. The goal requires certain practical measures. The goal requires certain methods. Our society is not oriented toward this goal. Our society does not practice these methods. In order to pursue this goal, you have to do what St. Augustine talked about when he said you have to turn around and swim against the river of human custom or the human ways of doing things. The goal requires a certain way of life. The goal requires certain practical measures. This is what creates real Christian culture. The actual life, the habits and the activities and the practical measures that are associated with achieving a goal is what creates real Christian culture, not fake, fictional, fantasy Christian culture, which is what most Christians spend their time talking about. But real Christian culture is goal-oriented, practical living that produces a certain lifestyle in certain circumstances of time and place. A new Christian culture has to develop in 21st century America, where we seek classical Catholic education, and the practical measures that we take to achieve that goal create for us a way of life. Homeschooling parents are wasting resources by spending money on things that will not help them to reach the goal. There are methods of education, ideas about education, certain ideas about culture, ideas about what school should look like that do not lead students to the goal. Every dollar spent on these methods, on these ideas, on these resources is money wasted. Every minute spent on those ideas and on those resources is a minute wasted. A minute you can't get back. A dollar you can't get back. And the truth is, the path to real classical Catholic education doesn't require much money. Money is not going to be the limiting factor. The wasting of money, the wasting of time, and the refusal to follow the counsel of the wise men who actually know how to get to the goal is what causes Christian families to fail. As an example, there is no possible way that you can give your children a real Christian education with printed books. There's no way. It's too expensive. It would be almost infinitely expensive for you to try to give your children a classical Catholic education, a real Christian education, the kind of education that was known by the saints and wise men of the past. It's virtually impossible. I would say it's impossible for you to give your children that education with printed books. You cannot afford the books that would be necessary to do that. This idea of private education where students buy all their books was never practiced in world history. This is a modern consumer culture idea that was invented with the public schools. When schools, using tax money, started buying truckloads of study materials for their fantasy grade level school program. Publishers started cranking out as much content and material as they could because all of this state funding was available to these schools to just buy and buy and buy school supplies. Throughout history, no one even had private copies of books. This is part of the fantasy world. You watch a movie about some Victorian estate and you see the man in his library, but you don't realize that that man was a landlord who governed hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. And his personal library was basically the only library in the entire area, the only access to books anywhere in the area. And it was something that was built over generations in an economy that doesn't even exist today, and for a purpose that is not necessary today. And you may watch movies and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have... You're living in fantasy land. You don't need that library. You can't afford a physical library for the books that are needed for a classical Catholic education. You cannot afford it. And to sit there and just buy what you can afford makes no sense. You're putting book buying and book collecting as an end in itself ahead of the actual goals of the education. And this is what homeschool parents do. They post Instagram videos of their boxes of junk books, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars of junk homeschool books, as if they're accomplishing something other than just buying books. It's an end in itself that, like I said, has no place in the actual path to the goal. You cannot afford to buy books to give your children a classical Catholic education. Classical Catholic education in the past was conducted in monasteries where the monks were the book copiers. They had access to the books and the study materials because the monastery was the place where the books were kept and copied. And even in old schools and classrooms, the students didn't have their own copies of books. The books were usually printed for the teacher, and the teacher would dictate to the students content that needed to be memorized, exercises that needed to be completed, and the students would copy that down. The teacher would dictate the exercises or the content to the student, or simply read the book to the class and tell the children what they should write down, and that was it. The education is mental, not physical. This idea that you have of buying books, of filling shelves with books, of ordering books, has nothing to do with real Christian education. It's a modern idea, and you likely are attracted to it by something that's not realistic, or that has nothing to do with the goal of education. We live in an anti-Christian society, and yet we have incredible advantages and benefits. The principal advantage and benefit we have is the internet. And you can sit there and you can spite yourself and say, well, I don't like this. When you do that, you shut off access to classical Catholic education. You can spite yourself and do that. But if you choose to take a lazy, ignorant position like that and just blame the internet for your inability to use it effectively, you're just spiting yourself. And the minute you do that, you're finished. Because in this generation, it's the only path. Private schools can't do it for you. Book-selling homeschool programs can't do it for you. The only way that your children can get a real classical Catholic education is to take advantage of the benefits that are available, because all of the necessary study materials are available to them in this generation in God's amazing providence for free. No one in the history of the world, other than monks who lived in the monasteries that kept the books, had access to the resources that our families have access to. And if you choose the stupid, self-spiting position that you are going to make the internet the enemy of your Christian culture, you're going to be an ignorant person. And you are not going to give your children a classical Catholic education. All of the money spent on homeschool books is a waste. And I said all of the money spent on homeschool books in 2022 is a foolish waste of money. It's not going to accomplish anything significant. Whatever is accomplished could have been accomplished by far more efficient means. And it's the kind of silliness that actually plagues Christian families and leaves them fussing about the limitations of money in their homeschooling when money is not even necessary. It's not money that's restricting the education. It's the self-spiting refusal to learn how to actually study and teach in the 21st century with the amazing resources available and choosing to do things in a way that is financially unsustainable. That's the cause of the problem. Not how much money Dad makes, but how stupid the plan is to try and pursue a classical Catholic or a real Catholic education in the 21st century by buying printed copies of books that are available to your children for free. It's not the money, it's the plan. The money is used as an excuse. And ultimately, the children are paying for their parents' spiteful position where they try to make the internet out to be some kind of boogeyman. And pretend that avoiding the internet is what makes you like the saints, which is just a delusion. Now, what parents should save their money for? And I'm just going to say that as a father of 10 children who takes these practical measures seriously, I created and have constantly improved the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to make real classical Catholic education available to Catholic families for almost nothing. That's a very central focus of how I do what I do, what decisions I make, how I choose to present lessons, and so on. Taking into consideration the costs is not just an option, it's the whole point of education. It's where the prudence lies, to actually be able to accomplish the goals of real Christian education in real circumstances, is why the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is what it is. To enroll a student in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and make thousands and thousands of dollars worth of study resources available only cost $25 a month. If you subscribe for a year, it costs even less, only $20 a month. And that provides kids with access, like I said, to thousands and thousands of dollars of study materials, support from a full-time Catholic classicist tutor that you can't find in your neighborhood, all of the academic resources that the kids need for classical Catholic education are available in one place for one simple, affordable monthly fee. $25. And if that's too expensive, contact me and I'll lower the price. I really don't care. If you can't afford $25 a month, just contact me and tell me what you need. Tell me what you can afford and we'll do it. I don't care. If you have more than 3 children, we offer a family plan for $100 a month, and that's it. That's the cap on enrollment fees. So whether you have 4 kids or 10 kids, you would never pay more than $100 a month. And again, if that's too expensive, contact me and tell me what you can afford, and we'll make a deal. Like I said, I don't care. You can have the entire classical Catholic curriculum available to your children for one simple monthly payment and have no limit on their Catholic studies. Not to mention online quizzes, assignment grading, support whenever they need it, on and on. It's the only realistic path to the goal. It's the only realistic path to the goal. If you have other money as a family, what I recommend is you not waste that money on homeschool supplies, but you use that money to improve the quality of your family life. If you make your children live a miserable life because all the money is spent and there's no money to do anything, there's no money for decent clothes, there's no money for decent shoes or a decent bed, there's no money for a quality music lesson for a student who is actually skilled and willing to study the piano. The activities that actually require paid services. I've told you, my children are in jiu-jitsu classes and dance classes. Those things radically change the quality of life for a family, for children, for their education. There are things to invest in that cannot be provided otherwise, and that radically change the quality of their lives. Money that's available in a homeschool family has to be conserved for those things. And that could be true of classical education. For example, if you had a child who was zealous to be a priest or a monk and wanted to just devour classical studies, you might want to pay for what's called a premium student plan to have me be able to work with that kid directly through live chat tutoring sessions. That's an option for a kid who has that desire. If you have a kid who wants to join the military, it would be much better for you to sign him up for jiu-jitsu classes and have him have access to that training and that environment and all of the benefits of that activity, which directly affects his future plans. If you have girls and you'd like to encourage them to be strong and healthy and graceful, dance lessons will radically change their lives. And I'm not talking about some kind of gross urban dancing, hip-hop dance classes. I'm talking about classical ballet. Those kinds of activities, those kinds of opportunities, local health club membership where the kids can go and exercise and develop habits that they can keep for their entire lives. You have to be very careful where you use the money that's available, because many families blow all of their money on garbage homeschool supplies, garbage books, garbage study materials, throwaway workbooks, hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And in the end, the kids have nothing to show for it. It accomplishes nothing. It robs the quality of the kids' lives. At the end of the year, what do? Sell these, get into this ghetto culture of selling used throwaway books for dollars to other homeschool families, or hunting down the best bargain on somebody's used books. That's Christian culture. It's because families can't afford to buy the books that they need, but they're so committed to this foolish plan to learn through printed books that they're willing to barter and trade and hunt the internet and go to conferences to try to find a discount on some book that's not even worth the cost of the paper it's printed on. When books of infinitely greater value, the actual works of the masters themselves, you can't even imagine the resources that are available, are accessible for free if the parents would just wake up and live in their own generation. Focus on the goal and let the goal determine the path, not impose some self-spiting artificial method into a life that could be doing so much more. Homeschool parents have to be very careful how they use their resources, because the use of money can produce radical effects in your children's lives, or they can leave your children with nothing simply because you used the money on the wrong things. If the kids are barely clothed, if the kids don't have anything to do because mom blows all the available cash on homeschool supplies that she brags about with her homeschool friends, the kids are actually not getting the things that they need, while the house is just filled with junk. And it's very common in homeschool circles. The family can barely afford clothes for the kids because they've blown all the money on homeschool supplies. A kid can't have a bike to ride because he's got 65 boxes of first and third grade homeschool books in the basement. Kid can't get a piano lesson because there's no cash available, because thousands and thousands of dollars have been blown on homeschool supplies that barely accomplish grade level requirements. It's just such a foolish plan. Just doing what other homeschool families are doing with no thinking, no goal-oriented thinking, no prudence, ignoring all of the benefits available, denying the children access to all of the resources available to them, and leaving them most of the time idle, because once the 2 hours of homeschool workbook studies are completed, there's nothing else for the kids to do, and there's no money left to do anything, so the kids just sit around with nothing to do. And they're told that they should just go find a book to read, because again, books are going to be the solution. Just sit around and read a book, even though that's equivalent to watching television. But because we've decided that book reading is the activity of saints, we make books into this weird end of human existence. And the reality is, we don't even need printed books in our generation. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy was designed to give Catholic homeschooling families access to the best resources available for real classical Catholic education at an incredible fraction of the cost of these resources. To give parents access to resources that no one in history has had access to. This is the benefit of our generation. This is the benefit of our generation that allows us to overcome the obstacles of our generation. And Catholic families are wasting them. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy makes all of these things available for free. If you simply want to access the study materials, you can do so for free. If you go to the website at classicalliberalarts.com, you can see you can enroll in the courses for free and access all of the study materials that have been collected and organized. 25 years of research and collecting is available for free. If you want to enroll the children so that they can take quizzes and have their assignments graded, have records, have support so they can ask questions and get help when they need it, it only costs $25 a month. And that includes all courses. And like I said, if you have more than 3 children, the cap is set at 4 children. So you'll never pay more than $100 a month, and you have access to everything that you need for a classical Catholic education, with expert support to help you and to help your children. If you can't afford those prices, contact me, tell me what you can afford, and we'll make a deal. I want your children to enjoy access to these resources, and I want to encourage you to open your mind to the reality that these resources are available to us, and the internet is not a boogeyman. As a parent, you need to supervise the children, but the internet is not some source of evil. For those who use it responsibly, it's a source of incredible good. And as Catholic parents, you need to make these resources available to your children and not spite them, because you're going to make them pay for it in the end. It's not going to work. The money that you save by not blowing on books and useless homeschool supplies can be used to invest in your children's lives and give them opportunities to do things that radically affect their quality of life. Things like clothing, things like food, a family trip to the beach, a car that doesn't break down, dance lessons, music lessons, martial arts classes, a gym membership. These things radically affect the quality of life, depending on their unique interests and abilities. Like I said, some kids can just love studies, and you'd be wise to invest in giving them the opportunity to work with a tutor. We offer that service in the academy, but it's not necessary unless a student really has that drive, as some students do. But homeschool parents need to stop pretending that money is an obstacle for their children's education and realize that how they use that money is the actual problem. In 2022, you cannot afford to give your children a Christian education with printed study materials. Remember, I told you so. In 2022, you cannot afford to give your children a real Catholic education if you're going to insist on printed study materials. You're going to block the path for your children to get a real Catholic education in this generation, and you're going to regret it. I hope that's a helpful talk. I know it might be challenging, especially if you hold these ideas that I mentioned, but I encourage you, as a serious Catholic homeschooling father, I understand why you might be hesitant, but I encourage you to get rid of that hesitancy. Make prudent use of your family's resources. Enrich the quality of your children's lives by investing the money you do have in better things for them, and don't waste it on printed study materials. God bless.